Hi, I'm Sunday. On a planet called Origin, some people are transgender. I'll talk about the history of trans people there, the culture about them in different areas within it, and though HRT, which stands for Hormone Replacement Therapy, isn't a requirement for trans people, I'm personally fascinated by how it works, so I'll talk about how it affects the different kinds of people on Origin. First, I'll establish what it means to be transgender. On Origin, it's a type of frog. No, it means someone whose current gender identity isn't the same as the one they were assigned at birth. For example, someone may have been born with female bits, so their parents and everyone around them assigned the female gender identity to them. As they got older, they didn't relate so much to that label and started going by neutral pronouns, so they, them. That person would be considered non-binary, which is under the umbrella term of transgender. This can happen for any combo of sex assigned at birth and any gender you could identify with, though it most commonly starts with male or female and ends with female, male, or non-binary. It could also end with something ambiguous, because who needs labels anyway? Like I said before, it's common for trans people to get something called hormone replacement therapy, or HRT for short, to make their body more similar to how they prefer to be viewed by society. I'll talk all about that and how it works in a sec. They may even get surgery to change things that aren't affected by HRT. It's important to note though that none of those treatments are required for someone to be considered trans. They're extremely helpful, and it's overwhelmingly common for a trans person to be happy with their treatment, but not all trans people want that sort of treatment either. It totally depends on their preference, and it doesn't make someone more or less trans. With all that out of the way, let's talk about dragons. Because of their stark sexual dimorphism, Draconia culture tends to be heavily gendered. For example, men are often expected to carry things for women, protect them, and lead food or labor operations, while women are often expected to lead for anything else, but also be silent in matters apart from leadership. The main exception to that is the king, who can do whatever he likes and rule as he wishes, but he's not transgender, so that's not important to this video. Even food is gendered, and men get larger portions than women, with larger percentages of lean meat. All this can make it really difficult for someone to try crossing over and experimenting with how they feel about living as a gender they weren't assigned at birth. Even worse, there's not much of an option for someone who doesn't identify with either to not have to pick one all the time. What are you gonna do? Ask the guy at Ahmed's Dragon Burgers if you can have a 1.5 patty dragon burger with a 33:67 ratio of red to white meat rather than 25:75 or 50:50. Ahmed is a nice guy, but he would never do that. Luckily for queer people in Draconia though, cities are often a safe place where people can break those kinds of rules a bit. That's a theme you'll find throughout Origin, though there are definitely exceptions. Some food joints in Tanyonopolis or Animopolis might even have a non-binary or in-between option on the menu, and people will definitely be more okay with someone they perceive as one gender doing something associated with the other. This probably has to do with cities being densely populated with different types of people and cultures, and also the higher concentration of educated people. Culture around trans people is more variable with Tanyan, and it can be better because of the less drastic sexual dimorphism, but also worse because of certain values they hold. For example, Tanyan in the far west value unity in such a way that they tend to look down on people who are different, especially in obvious ways. They can be pretty harsh to someone who breaks one gender stereotype, and worse to someone who breaks them all. It's much better in the Tombstone Relic though, where trans people in various forms have been recorded since recordings began. They didn't go by the same names and use the same terms, of course, but as long as gender has existed as a social concept, there have been people who preferred to be different than what's expected from the gender they were assigned at birth. As an artist, something I'm very interested in is what trans people, Ñushus in this case, look like. Of course, they can look like literally any Ñushus can, but thanks to HRT, there's some interesting quirks about their anatomy. Hormone replacement therapy is legal in Draconia, and though it can take a while to get everything ready, it is free for citizens like most healthcare. If someone starts it early enough, suppressing the hormones they get during puberty and replacing it with what they're looking for, they would likely look like literally any other man or woman in a few years. We could be looking at two trans Ñushus here and not know it. Unfortunately, not many people are lucky enough to figure out their identity before puberty, and even less are lucky enough to have supportive parents to help them with that. So, most trans people who go through HRT do that in their young adulthood, in their 20s and 30s. Ñushus reach full maturity roughly at the age of 33, when the hair on their temples begins to go silver. However, it's culturally normal for them to leave the shelter of their parents as young as 16, and as old as till their parents die. I think it's super important to make it clear that while I will be drawing something like the average trans people of different species, and explaining features that are often more common to see in them, almost nothing is a hard rule, and there's never a foolproof way to clock a trans person. For example, Ñushus trans women are generally larger than Ñushus cis women. However, it's more than possible for a Ñushus trans woman to be smaller than the average Ñushus cis woman. Using myself to solidify the example, I have the average height and even hand size of the average cis woman of my species in my country, even though I started HRT after I finished growing. With that out of the way, let's get super started. Starting with trans women, which I'm biased towards since I am one, it's common for them to have slight to full forked horns depending on when they start a transition. It's next to impossible to safely remove them because of the concentration of blood, fat, and other important components, especially when the horns are fully developed. This is especially the case for Northern Draconiae, who have the most impressively forked horns of all Ñushus. If they were old enough before starting transition, they might have been balding, but their hair usually comes back after some time on HRT. The beard won't go away, but it's nothing a quick shave every once in a while can't fix. The most obvious secondary sex characteristic, especially for Draconiae, is their size. There's unfortunately not much a trans femme Ñushus can do about this, but I think they pull it off well. As for the things that do change, the first thing is that it quickly becomes difficult to look into their eyes, and they must cover them like most other women. It's still disputed as to why this happens, but it's probably some weird magic that evolved to keep women safe from imposing men. As their muscle to body fat ratio changes, their skin will become softer and they might have a harder time pulling the same weight. The biggest thing, and the main reason why trans femme Ñushus older than 30 still opt in for HRT, is that it vastly extends their lifespan. Male Ñushus are generally fertile their whole adult lives, but it drops off extremely at a certain point as their organs and entire body begin to fail. For this reason, no male Ñushus in recorded history has lived past 70. Without the hormones forcing their body to output at max power all the time, they can live for much longer, not uncommonly to 100. Still, trans femme Ñushus are thought to be among the least lucky of all the types of people, because after a certain point it will always be incredibly easy to pick them out in a crowd of other women. As for trans men, the only thing that HRT doesn't change at all after full maturity is their size. In time, the weird eye magic thing will go away, their beard will grow in, their muscle to body fat ratio will change, they'll go bald if they're Draconiae, and they'll even get fully forked horns after a decade or so. The reason for the easier change is that in the case of most Ñushus and many other animals, men have most or all of the secondary sex characteristics. These are hard to reverse but can come in just fine with hormones. The reason for secondary sex characteristics, SSC for short since I'm going to be mentioning a lot in this video, being more common for males is that males tend to have a lot more to prove to females than vice versa. Females have to lay the big nutritious eggs and/or carry the nutritionally expensive babies inside them, and even take care of the babies after that sometimes. Males don't have to do much in most cases other than shoot goop, so naturally it becomes their responsibility to prove themselves to the female. It's not so one-sided in monogamous species where males do take part in caring for the babies and such, so that tends to be where you see more obvious SSCs in females. Next, Psudoxians. This video is going to be long, and it's going to take me a long time to make, isn't it? The country of Psudoxia was formed only recently, after its freedom from Draconia a few decades ago under the Good King's rule. Since then, it's unfortunately gotten worse for trans people. It's still legal as of recording for adults to access HRT, but it's not covered by public state healthcare along with mental health treatment and dental care. Anyway, the political situation is not great for trans people in Psudoxia, as they, along with some other minorities, are blamed for all the country's problems. For this reason, many trans people are moving out to safer countries like the nearby Draconia and Lycan. The safest place in Psudoxia for trans people is Xaikmos, its largest and capital city, where a slight majority of people have largely different political views than the rest of the country. While Psudoxians don't have gendered food, they often have gendered bathrooms, where there is a lot of social stigma about going to the quote-unquote wrong one. It's even illegal, though rarely if ever enforced. Trans people there will often stick to private, non-gendered bathrooms to avoid any sort of confrontation. Psudoxian sexual dimorphism isn't as drastically obvious as with many Ñushus, but there are a few SSCs on both sides. Males are slightly larger with proportionately bigger feet and hands, and a higher ratio of muscle to body fat. Most obviously, they have long horns that curl back under their ears and thick hair on the sides of their face. Females have more body fat, often in the form of larger breasts and wider hips. They have short horns that curve only slightly backwards, and sparse but long hair on the sides of their face. All Psudoxians can control the movement of their hair with their psychic powers, and seemingly change the color of their skin, hair, eyes, and horns by creating vibrations that affect how light reflects off them. They naturally have sparse but long body hair in both sexes, especially on their limbs, though some cultures will shave it off because of historical rule by Ñushus. Psudoxians have 4 long whiskers extending near the tip of their snout, but those who shave their body hair also burned the faces of children to remove any such facial hair. Again, this was due to Ñushus' rule in the past, which I talk about more extensively in my recent Anthropology video about Ñushus. Trans feminine Pseudosians going through HRT will experience a change in body fat distribution and in time will resemble cisgender females in that way. Everyone has different genetics according to that, so some may experience more drastic changes than others. Their horns don't shrink and their facial hair never thins, similar to Ñushus, because while testosterone creates hair follicles, the existing hair follicles are maintained through normal metabolic activity that can't be easily undone. So trans femme Pseudosians commonly just shave the sides of their face, as that's preferred over a bushy beard. Many cis femme Pseudosians also do this, so it's not a big deal and just seen as a style preference. So while trans femme Pseudosians may be slightly taller than most other Pseudosian women, the feature they're more often persecuted for is the long horns. Notably, if a trans femme Pseudosian goes through HRT early enough, their horns will look much more like other women. Trans masculine Pseudosians going through HRT will also experience a change in body fat distribution, but because breasts are a bit more complicated than just body fat, they are often still noticeable after years of HRT. Trans mas Pseudosians will experience muscle growth on HRT, but they won't get any taller. Other than that, thicker facial hair will grow in, and with time their horns will even grow to full size. Although it can be uncomfortable, trans mas Pseudosians will often wear something called a binder to make their breasts less visible. This makes trans mas Pseudosians who have been through HRT for longer than a few years look indistinguishable from other men, so they're often ignored in the media for that and other cultural reasons that make them less scary and or less interesting to the average dipshit. While trans women are often depicted as terrifying predators or brave warriors depending on the political angle, trans men are more likely to be depicted as confused, or they're just completely ignored. Lycans are an interesting and unusual case when it comes to the subject of trans people, but so are the next two groups of people I'll talk about. Every Lycan that most people, including other Lycans, will meet are female. The only people exposed to male Lycans are the queen and her caretakers, and male Lycans aren't even sapient. Because of this, gender and sex are not important parts of their culture, and it's rare for a Lycan coming to a different culture to care about what gender they're referred to as. All Lycans are born and raised in Lycan territory and culture, with the few exceptions to the raised part having to do with stolen children. This is because only the queen lays eggs and the babies tend to be raised communally rather than by any one person or couple. No one has tried HRT on a Lycan because they're distantly related to other sapient species, which are mostly vertebrates, and even if it worked, the effect couldn't possibly be good. So even if the Lycan prefers to be referred to as a man, they won't be any different biologically and they wouldn't want to be. Nykteridajin, also known as Crazimals, are even more unusual, as they're from a distant planet and less closely related to us than we are to anything else on the planet, with the possible exception of monsters like the Calvinjin. They sexually reproduce but are sequential hermaphrodites of a form unknown to zoologists before 100 years ago. They're bidirectional sex changers, meaning they can swap to and fro at different points in their life. As their larval form, they have no sexual apparatus except in extremely rare circumstances that likely led to the speciation of the Niki. While in the pupa stage of development, they develop what we would think of as male or female bits according to their preference. After becoming an adult, they go through a mating season every year, and after that their bits may change according to their preference or last season's success. The changes to their sexual apparatus are not very apparent without scientific equipment. The only difference is that the egg sac becomes a sperm sac or vice versa, and the urethra may double as an ovipositor or a penis. The eggs are very small and shaped in such a way as to make them easy to pass, and they're fertilized externally in a moist but not wet area so that eggs don't dry out or grow mold. Gender doesn't really exist in their society, but a dominant personality with a deep voice is associated with egg layers, while a more submissive personality with a soft voice is associated with sperm spreaders. It's so normalized to change between these in Nykteridajin society that it would be reasonable to say that everybody and nobody is trans at the same time. The only exception is with the royal family, within which there's even morphological differences depending on the role of the person. It's thought that this is related less to genetic relatedness and more to the pressures and experiences of the royal family because certain changes happen even to Nykteridajin who are not associated with the Darling of Oblivion and not genetically related. For example, the partner of a royal. Sorry that this doesn't have a whole lot to do with trans people, but it's related to gender and I wanted to share it. You could skip to the next section if you just want to hear about trans people. Nykteridajin royalty almost seems like a completely different species to the others. They're monogamous, dimorphic, and have characteristically different behavior. It all centers on the Darling of Oblivion, the singular and unchallenged ruler of Nykteridajin society. As a larva, he ate large amounts of a strange substance called royal jelly. It has a lot of a rare nutrient that causes a sort of metamorphosis light in Nykteridajin and related organisms. In the Darling of Oblivion, it makes him larger and more muscular, with a defined beard and dark spots on his fur. It gives his voice a certain depth that has a neotenizing effect on other Nykteridajin, giving them a smaller size and flatter face. Unlike others of his species, the Darling of Oblivion strictly lays eggs and may be unable to switch to sperm production. He maintains a masculine persona and masculine pronouns when dealing with more gendered sorts of people like Ñushus. He has many concubines, which mate only with him and raise his offspring by hand rather than allowing them to fly free. The other people who are affected by his presence also act differently, and have one mating partner with whom they raise larvae and keep them separate from the village larvae. In this way, the royalty and their blood doesn't usually escape to the common people. This is probably by design. The other species from that planet is Arbojin, a herbivorous group of people who commonly fall prey to Nykteridajin. Each Arbojin simultaneously has sperm-generating and egg-laying organs, so they don't have much of a concept for gender either. They use separate pronouns for their chief, who went through a sort of metamorphosis with a similar royal jelly, but the difference in pronouns isn't related to genders as most of us know them. For this reason, though, most Budogs are referred to in the common tongue with male pronouns, while the chief or queen is referred to with female pronouns. Similar to Lycans, Nykteridajin or Arbojin, familiar with a more gendered culture, may end up preferring different sets of pronouns despite their bits situation. The Stormfolk of the Glacian don't have immediately obvious SSCs to those familiar with people like Ñushus and humans, but a look at their ears, chin, hands, and feet quickly reveal a difference between male and female Trifol. Men tend to have long pointed ears, a square jaw, and much larger hands and feet than women, who have a rounded ears and chin. Men usually also have darker skin than women, but this is the least reliable tell because there's enough diversity that it's not uncommon to see a woman with darker skin than a man. Trifol society has a complicated perception around trans people. For a long time, and until very recently, they were governed by a strict monarchy. People in the outskirts did not have strong beliefs around how people should act beyond not hurting others, but any interactions with the ruling class required a complex politeness. In this way, the Kingdom of Clover is one of the exceptions for cities being better for queer people. Because more populated areas interacted with the ruling class the most, they developed the highest amount of disdain for those who didn't follow society's norms. This is no longer fully the case because of the Novakist Revolution, but historical influences tend to rear their heads long after the original cause has disappeared. Nowadays, Clover as a whole is a much better place for trans people, and there are reliable sources for stuff like HRT. A big cause for this is Novak himself, who is most likely a trans man. The way that his revolution changed things was deeper than just legalizing certain things. He basically got rid of the government itself. People call him a king, but he doesn't actually have any power besides social influence. The way people in Clover get HRT isn't through a connected healthcare system, but through their highly developed postage system from someone who can make those medications. They don't pay any money or anything at all for this, but everyone is expected to make themselves useful in some other way. For example, one person may be a farmer who grows rye and gives rye to everyone who requests it. Everyone has their thing, and society just sort of works out that way without any money. The only issue is that if someone isn't making themselves useful and has no good reason for it, people might stop giving them things. For example, the rye farmer may not give you rye if he notices you aren't giving anything of your own. He would know this by either knowing you in person or searching the name you gave in the mail in a huge book. The rye farmer could also refuse to give you rye if he didn't like you, but this is less socially acceptable and people might not respect him as much if they found out this was a common thing he did. Anyway, I talk about how the system works in my video about humans if you're interested. Let's talk about what transgender Trifol look like. Trans feminine Trifol going through HRT will notice a lot of changes in cartilage and body fat distribution. Their ears, hands, and feet will shrink to somewhere sort of between the average for cisgender men and women. They may also notice a bit of a shift in their chin and jawline to be a bit more feminine. Most notably though, their body fat distribution changes to their breasts and hips. All in all, they might look sorta in between male and female except for the boobs and hips, which makes them more recognizably female. Of course, this can be very different depending on when they started HRT, and since the revolution, trans kids going on HRT before or during puberty in such a way that there would be no discernible way to tell they're trans is more common in Clover than the places I've talked about already. Basically, in Clover, it's becoming more likely that you might run into trans people that you wouldn't know were trans without them telling you, which is cool. Transmasculine Trifol going through HRT experience a lot of similar changes, but in the other direction. Their ears, hands, and feet will get very close to the average for cis men though, as it's a lot easier to grow bone and cartilage than to shrink it. While their body fat distribution does change, breasts that were already there don't really go away. So a lot of trans men opt for those binders I mentioned before. Their chin and jaw tend to adjust similar to the average for cis men as well, so other than the boobs, transmass Trifol usually can basically look just the same as cis men. I'm sure you're picking up the pattern with SSCs and all. Finally, the humans of the Orient. The main SSCs with men are a tall and muscular build with facial hair and a generally more hairy body. They might also have a slightly stronger chin. Women tend to be much shorter and a bit softer, with no facial hair and generally less body hair. They also have larger breasts and wider hips like with some other mammals. Because there are a lot of countries in the Orient, the situation for trans people varies widely, but generally trends toward bad. In Anthropos and Lunix, the situation is awful, but worse in cities for similar reasons as was the case in Clover years ago. Unfortunately, a revolution doesn't seem as imminent, though pressures grow in Anthropos for a democratic election. The best place in the Orient for trans people is Stridaland, the only democratic country there and one of the most educated in the world. Trans feminine humans going through HRT mainly experience a body fat redistribution similar to the ones in Trifol and Psudoxians. Their hands and feet may shrink slightly, but due to redistribution rather than actual bone shrinking. Similar things happen with their faces shifting slightly towards the average cis woman. They keep their height though, so the average trans woman is a good bit taller than the average cis woman. Again, they pull it off well in my opinion. Their facial hair remains, so they have to shave it routinely. Transmasculine humans going through HRT also go through a body fat redistribution, but in the other direction. And they don't usually lose their boobs for the reasons I mentioned before with Trifol and Psudoxians. They do gain facial hair though, which is a big plus. They don't get any taller like with the others. In the middle, we have an example of a non-binary person, also known as an NB, who doesn't care about labels and is badass and awesome. I don't know what they're going to do with the axe, but it's probably cool. All these people live safely in Draconia, so don't worry about them being in danger in their homeland. There's something extra I want to talk about concerning humans who can fuse with other animals. Depending on where they're from, they can do that. In this example, these are people who are fused with something according to their gender at the time and later when on HRT. As you can see, especially if you're familiar with Timberzards, that the non-human animal they fuse with is also affected by HRT. In the case of the Timberzard, she lost her bright coloration associated with males, and in the case of the Corno, his horns grew larger. Apart from this, there's also people who fuse with an animal of their preferred sex rather than the biological one they have at the moment, and take on their bits and associated hormones. It's kind of like HRT, except you don't have to take any medication. It can be pretty jarring at first to suddenly have a totally different set of hormones, but it seems to work well for people in the long run. Lastly, as an honorable mention, I'm gonna talk about elves. They don't have any SSCs, and HRT doesn't seem to do anything to them. They don't have much of an idea of gender in their society, but some who want to present as feminine will shave their beards. An extremely notable elf, however, could be considered trans under some definitions. The twice-cursed prince, Asterius Kinagat, had a rare mutation that seemed to give him clear feminine SSCs despite being an elf. However, he clearly considered himself a man, so he could maybe be considered trans even though it's not really like that for elves and he didn't really think of himself that way. Twice cursed comes from the common folklore that elves were cursed to be the way they are, and while the prince lost the curse, that in itself was a sort of second curse. It kind of makes sense if you think about it, I don't know. That's all I got for this video. I hope I wasn't gone for so long that everyone forgot I existed. I intend to have more regular uploads starting here. Hopefully I will have a video next week, and the week after that, and so on. Until I die. Not really. Check out my Patreon if you want to pay $1 a month to support my channel and have your name at the end of my videos. Thanks Lena, Art of Dying, Saint Starman, and Aster for subscribing to my Patreon. Oh god, this video script is 8 pages long. Okay, bye! I'm gonna go try to catch a Bulbasaur.